So, I was just thinking, where's the best place to run these experiments with radioactivity? And then I thought, you silly sausage, obviously the best place is the staff room kitchen. And that reminds me of a little quick story, if you want to listen, about this incredible scientist that I went to see a lecture from when I was at university, a guy called James Lovelock, who wrote a book, has written many books about a theory called Gaia theory, which is treating the whole Earth, the whole planet, as one super organism. But this guy's incredible. He started off life as a chemist. He got chucked out of university because his teachers, his chemistry teacher, decided that he was cheating, because the chemistry teacher decided that it wasn't possible that somebody could get a calculation or this experiment that they were doing, this test they were doing, that he could get it so spot on right, and he got expelled. And the reason he got it so spot on was the fact that he started off, before he went to university, working as a lab technician in a pharmacy. So he got all of his practical know-how and experience when he was 12, 13, 14, 15 years old. And this guy has worked for the oil companies, he's worked as a geologist, he's worked with chemistry, making new lubricants for car engines and stuff. He's worked as a scientific advisor for the UK government. And one of his, two of his great stories, one of his great stories was how he made his own heart bypass, because the doctors told him he needed a heart bypass, and he would have to wait. And whilst he was on the waiting list, he thought, you know, a heart bypass, why not gradually build up an exercise routine of walking, and try and widen one of the other veins around my heart to provide enough oxygen for my heart. And a couple of times, you know, he passed out and woke up by the side of the road because he'd almost had a heart attack and died. And then when he finally went for the operation, the surgeons opened him up and closed him straight back up again, because he had in fact managed to widen one of his blood vessels and made himself his own heart bypass. Incredible guy, totally crazy, but aren't all the best scientists. And one of his other stories, well, for example, one of his big mistakes, he said, was he told the UK government that the most efficient way of farming was not to have small fields with hedgerows. He told them to get rid of the hedgerows and make big fields, which would be more efficient for farming. And he said that this was one of his biggest regrets in life, because when they did that, he realised pretty soon afterwards that hedgerows actually were like passageways or roadways that small animals could use to get from one bit of woodland to another through the hedgerow. And if you take away all these hedgerows and you just have isolated patches of woodland, you gradually start to lose all these small species that are unable to migrate. As soon as they try to leave one woodland, an eagle or a predatory bird gets them. So he then, about 4 or 5 years later, tried to convince the government that it was best to put hedgerows back, and found that he couldn't convince them because they had increased the farming yields, and they didn't see the importance of maintaining the wildlife. And now, 50 years on, after James Lovelock, this scientist, has died, they are actually now trying to backtrack and fix this mistake that he realised he had made, but he couldn't convince the government to backtrack and fix this mistake whilst there was still time. Now, one of the stories he told me about radiation was, whilst he was working in this government lab, there was a big nuclear accident in the UK called the Windscale fire, where a nuclear reactor that was producing plutonium for the nuclear weapons program. It was actually an air-cooled nuclear reactor, so air was being sucked through the nuclear reactor core, things that nowadays have to be extremely well contained so that nothing gets out. Well, in the UK they were sucking air in one side and blowing air out the other side. And one of these reactors had actually set on fire, and they were fighting the fire, but unfortunately massive amounts of radioactive material were being released into the atmosphere. And in these government labs, of course, where they were working, all these scientists had radiation detectors on the walls. So his his really funny story was the fact that one day he was working in his lab and the radiation alarm went off. And in the good old days back then, of course, all these radiation detectors and these alarms and stuff, you could quite easily unplug them or take out the battery. So the common practice was, if you had a radiation incident in your lab, what would you do? You'd quickly take the battery out of the alarm to stop everybody getting in a big fuss. And of course, his alarm went off and he thought, oh, that's a bit strange, but I'll take the battery out quick before I get into trouble. And a few hours later, tried to put the battery back in, and the alarm went off again. Took the battery out, thought, oh my God, what's going on? I'm not working with any radioactive substance. But anyway, I'll leave the battery out just in case. And it wasn't until they went down to the canteen, and there's like 50, 60 scientists working in this lab, and of course all of them had taken the batteries out of their radiation alarms, and they were all sitting there rather quietly. Usually there was a lot of conversation, and he said he was looking around and seeing and making eye contact with the other scientists, and the other ones were like looking at him like saying, "Was it you?" And he said, "No." And he said, "Was it you? Was it?" Until eventually one of the managers stood up and said, "Right, look, who was it? Who had the radiation incident? Who's released radiation who's been working with radiation in this building? Whose fault was it?" And all the scientists just sat and looked and said, "It wasn't me, it wasn't me, it wasn't me." So the boss got extremely angry and phoned up the government to say that eventually they'd had this enormous radiation accident, but nobody would own up to it. And the government answered him straight back saying, "No, it wasn't you guys. We have a nuclear reactor that's on fire about 100 miles away from where you are. So your radiation alarms are going off because of the nuclear accident that was trying to keep under control 100 miles away from where you are. So don't worry, it wasn't you guys." But it actually took them like a good day or so to work out that it hadn't been them that had had this accident. And I mean, this guy was incredible. One of these kind of scientists that probably never heard of, but they don't exist anymore. Unfortunately, nowadays everything has to be much more strictly controlled, and there's no one scientist that makes the number of great discoveries and great work that this guy has done. And so I was completely in awe of this guy, and also completely in awe of the fact that in the good old days you could get away with having a nuclear radiation accident and kind of covering it up a bit. And that's what the UK government did. They covered up the Windscale reactor fire until many years afterwards, and you can still detect the radioactive plutonium that was released from this fire in areas around Sellafield, because they then turned the Windscale reactor nuclear accident site into the UK's reprocessing centre for nuclear waste. So they decided where there's lots of radioactive contamination, well, that's a good place to send all our radioactive waste, because nobody's really going to notice much of a difference. And that's what we're doing today. But anyway, I'm going to do a radioactivity experiment here for you guys. So I'll switch off and set up, and hopefully I won't have an accident. But if I do, don't worry, because I'm in the school staff room.